Alice Edwards, who's a yeah. That's right.
All right, so a little bit of a brief history here for those of you who don't know the history of the Cave Civic Award. So Dr. Alfred E. Cave was the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Toledo for many years, also a history professor. And his second wife, Mary Sue Deisha Cave, was an English professor, and she worked with the students in the Honors College, a much beloved faculty and a vital member of our league. And on her passing, her husband wanted to acknowledge her by making a donation to our League of Women Founders. And so we are grateful to his family for making sure that his wishes were fulfilled and the donation was made to our league. And so we are very proud to be able to continue supporting the education of students at the University of Toledo with this $1,000 scholarship.
Hi, my name is Ashley Westgate, and I was the recipient of the Civic Engagement Scholarship this year. I just finished my first year at the University of Toledo, and I am a political science major. I believe that it is very, very important for college students to get involved in civic engagement activities. If they don't start getting involved now, when are they going to start getting involved? And college students are the future of our country, and it's just very important that they start getting out now to understand the civic system. One of the things that I did recently was canvass for my local representative, and I found that so fascinating, and it really helped me get engaged with civics. And I completely understand that canvassing isn't for everyone. It takes a lot. It was actually really difficult for me to go out and do that the first time, because it involved, knocking on people's doors and telling them about the candidate's beliefs and all of that. And it was very scary at first, but a basic civic engagement activity that everyone should be participating in is voting in elections. And a lot of people, especially young people, don't really know the importance of voting in every election. So there, of course, are the elections that are every 4 years, the presidential elections. Those ones, obviously, very, very big for the country. But there's also the primaries and the midterms. So on campus, there is a voter coalition, which I was one of the honors representatives for. And so our goal was to get students more involved in the November midterm elections. So we bussed some students to the voting locations and taught students about the Ohio candidates so they could form their own opinions and beliefs on who they would like to vote for. Overall, though, civic engagement is just such an important thing that all college students should be immersing themselves in. And I hope through the Voter Coalition and some other work on campus, we can get more people to go out and vote in every election. So thank you for having me today, and enjoy the rest of the function.
Our speaker is Dr. Melissa Miller. She's a professor of political science at BGSU, and she is the executive producer and director of Trailblazing Women in Ohio Politics.
Thank you so much, Jennifer and the lead, for having me here today. It's really an honor to be here. I know it's the 103rd anniversary of the League of Women Voters nationwide. And wow. The league is absolutely second to none when it comes to a grassroots organization that is really trying to strengthen democracy. And I'm just so proud that on and off over the years, I shouldn't keep count, but between the Toledo chapter, Bowling Green and Perrysburg, I'm always delighted for those invitations to talk to the league. And hopefully in a minute, we'll have this Oh, I have to sign into my computer. Hang on a second.
Oh, you're fine.
All right, we're up and running now, I think. No, we're not. Okay, wait. So I am as Jennifer mentioned, I'm the executive producer and director of a public television documentary that I made with WVGU PBS called Trailblazing Women in Ohio Politics. Some of you will have maybe been to the screening that was held in Maumee at the Maumee Indoor Theater. It was so wonderful. We had a terrific turnout. It was wonderful to work with Anne and others and the Perrysburg and BG chapters. We had just an amazing turnout, and I was thrilled when somebody walked in the lobby and said, "You know, there's no parking available out there." And I said that we're really pleased. So I want to give a few remarks today about Trailblazing Women in Ohio Politics, but rather than tell you about the film, because many of you have seen it, and if you haven't seen it, www.bgsu.edu/trailblazers. All right. So if you haven't seen it, or you've seen it, or you learn about it today and want to tell folks about it, it's easy. Just stream it on the web and watch it. So I spent the month of March working with lead chapters here in Northwest Ohio and around the state, holding public screenings of Trailblazing Women in Ohio Politics. So it was a really busy month. And it was, just exhilarating, one of the most fascinating projects I've done since I came to BGSU in 2005. And I'd love to tell you that this project sprang to life in a year, right? Even 18 months. In fact, it was a 5-year process that it took to both raise the money and do all the research for Trailblazing Women in Ohio Politics. And when I started on the project in 2018, I have to tell you that, well, here's what I was attempting to explain. And it was sort of the driving interest I've had as a political scientist who studies gender and politics. And I just have one sample slide. There are others I can show you, but here's one data slide. You'll see one data slide today, so brace yourselves. Here it is. And then we'll mix it up with more fun stuff. But this slide shows the percentage of women in Congress from 1971 through the current congressional session. And this is a slide, the set of data that has really motivated my research agenda, and really served as a motivator for Trailblazing Women in Ohio Politics. Because I teach a class at BGSU called Women in American Politics, and the whole course, a semester, is organized around why so slow? Why are we still not near parity in terms of women's representation in Congress, state legislatures, state executive office, and so forth. And so that's what motivates my research. Now, one thing that you may note up there is that I've shaded an area of the slide from about the early 80s to the early 2000s. And it's this research. When I first started teaching at BGSU, my Women in American Politics class, the students really dug into the research that was conducted between the 80s and the early 2000s. And it was largely quantitative research, so it used surveys of women who run for office as well as men, surveys of women and men office holders, and it compared their responses. And it found some really interesting things that really explained a lot in terms of why there are so few women in elected office. And these findings were reported in a whole set of very scintillating academic journals and university press. Now, my students really loved reading all these scholarly articles. And in honesty, some of them are difficult, of course, and involve sophisticated statistical analysis to demonstrate significant gender-based differences. But I did find that despite the math involved, right, despite the statistics involved, my students were really compelled and puzzled and sometimes disappointed by what these studies found. And let me show you some of the broad findings from this set of quantitative statistical research that looked at survey response. In terms of political recruitment, women were less likely to be recruited to run for political office. They were more likely to be steered into unwinnable races. And we don't know what those, right? You're the Republican in a Democratic district. Your party is never going to win that congressional seat. Or you're the Republican, which way did I go? Or you're the Republican in the Democratic district. I'm trying to mix it up. And your party's never going to win. Well, guess what seats? Guess what races women were steered into running? The races that the party really didn't have a chance and they just needed somebody on the ticket. Women were considered less likely to win than men, and that was one of the reasons they were recruited at lower rates and they were steered into unwinnable races. And in general, men were favored by political gatekeepers. So we think of the political party officials, we think of just other like political even reporters who didn't take women seriously, kind of wrote them off. These were the findings from this quantitative research. In terms of the press coverage of women versus men, and this is where I have published some of my own research in this area, but historically, women were less likely to be covered at all. So they weren't mentioned. They couldn't get a featured story about them, or they were mentioned just as a throwaway at the end of the article written by the debate. Also on the stage was, right? And finally, there were ways in which when they did get coverage, that coverage wasn't very good. It wasn't substantive, right? So it tended to do things like talk about whether they were married and how many children they had. It might mention whether they were smiling or, whether they were in high heels, for instance, or what they were wearing, rather than the kind of coverage men got that very rarely mentioned such things. A third big sort of finding from this research had to do with stereotypes. And this is really a set of fascinating studies that did things like read descriptions of candidates to survey respondents, so hundreds of survey respondents, and at random, for half the respondents, the name of the candidate was Jane. And for the other half of the respondents at random, the candidate was John, all right? And descriptions of candidates were provided and then questions were answered by the respondents. And what did that research find? That if your name's Jane, you're assumed to be less tough than if your name's John. You're assumed to be less decisive than if your name's John. If your name's Jane, you're assumed to be less likely to win, all right? So this is the kind of research that I was teaching my students. I always found it fascinating, my students found it fascinating. And what happened was, I got the opportunity in 2018 to propose kind of a big project. And I decided that what I've always really wanted to do is bring this research about women and the challenges they face in American politics to the public. I wanted to get it out of the ivory tower, out of those academic journals, and get it on television, get it on the internet in a way that would be really, easy and interesting and compelling for a broad public audience. And so I did have one nagging question. Sort of, you can guess, or you already know, what's the end of the story? I did a public television documentary with WVGU, right? And I've got the website actually launched. I'm working on that this summer. But one of the nagging questions I had was, what if I go out and interview these trailblazing women in Ohio politics? And what they have to tell me bears no resemblance to what I thought I knew. And what political science has been saying all along. And it's not like I'm not prepared for, something, the unknown, but kind of like, I had never made a documentary before, to be honest with you, ever. And so I liked the idea that the content was going to be very familiar to me. But I did have this nagging question, will these women's stories, these trailblazing women in Ohio politics, these women who broke barriers, such as becoming the first woman speaker of the Ohio House, the first woman attorney general, the first African-American woman in the Ohio General Assembly, will their stories reflect this research? That was my question heading into it. So let's see what they said. Now, when you're doing qualitative research, and I've done a little over the years, I have done some qualitative research on and off, but mostly I'm that stats person, right? I'm the math person running the statistical models. So this was somewhat new. And the cardinal rule of doing qualitative research is that you don't go in saying, so I'm sure the political gatekeepers weren't excited about you running, right? You don't ask leading questions like that. Instead, you ask broad questions like, what prompted you to run for office that first time? And then you just hear what they have to say. You let them tell their stories in their own words. Let them tell you about their lived experience. And the problem was that I knew all this research, so I had certain expectations. I had to keep them to myself. So let's hear what happened once I, with the crew from WVGU PBS, went around the state and we did one interview in the summer of 2018. We did the rest in the summers of 2020 and 2021 and 2022. We interviewed a total of 11 women, 7 of whom are featured in the film Trailblazing Women in Ohio Politics. The others are bonus interviews on the website, and they add a lot. So when I asked, what prompted you to run for office that first time? The basic response, or let me just say, looking at all of their responses across all 11 interviews, the upshot is they were not recruited by political gatekeepers, all right? They were not. Those political powers that be weren't what motivated them. They did not get a call from, the county chair of their party. Oh, they'd love to see you run for city council. That didn't happen, okay, with one exception, which I'll get to. So let's hear from some of our trailblazers in their own words about why they ran for office in the first place. And it occurs to me, my son Nathan Engelhardt is here with me today. Wave to everybody. And he actually, in the summer of 2021, did some research on the project. So I'm actually going to put him to work. Can you turn around to the laptop and click the audio when you see it? This is Joanne Davidson, the first woman speaker of the Ohio House of Representatives. Let's pause it, Nathan, and let's back it up. Can you turn up the volume? This is the first one. I've got a number of these, and I want you to hear them in their own voice. I have also, if it's hard to hear, I've written every quotation up there, but I want you to hear them in their own voice, because sometimes they speak and they emphasize in a way that they're expressing sometimes it's their disgust, right? Sometimes it's their surprise. So hopefully we can get these working.
It was sort of one of these things that the light bulb went on. And I thought, let's see, I am making phone calls. I am putting up the yard signs. I am sponsoring the coffees. I am walking door to door. All of a sudden I thought, why don't I try to lift this? I'm raising 2 daughters, very active in schools. And so I just decided that I would try. Well, yeah, I first ran in 1965.
This is somebody who self-recruited. This was somebody who had been involved politically and had been involved in her party. She's a Republican. She had done all the things that party activists do. But nobody said, Joanne, what about running? Why don't you think about running? She self-recruited, and that proverbial light bulb went off. Let's look at this. Let's hear from another one. Oops. Oh, hang on. You know what? My clicker just activated it. Okay, so why don't, okay. All right. This is one of our bonus trailblazers. She's not in the film, so some of you who've seen it might be surprised. Nikki J. Antonio is a current Senate Minority Leader of the Ohio Senate, obviously. She's the first member of the LGBT+ community to be elected to both the Ohio House and the Ohio Senate. And she's been elected to leadership in both of those chambers. So let's see if I can, no. Nathan, can you click on, oh, this one doesn't have a link, sorry. Okay, here's what Nikki Antonio, Senator Antonio said. She first, by the way, she lives in Lakewood, and her first race was running for Lakewood City Council. She said, our older daughter wanted to skateboard, and there were a lot of kids skateboarding in Lakewood. So I went to City Council and advocated for the kids to have a skate park at Lakewood Park. I came home and I said, I'm really tired of explaining what's important for families and stuff. I said, I could do that job. I heard myself say, I could do that job. And I was like, oh my gosh, I could do that job. That was my dramatic reenactment. But she really said it like that. Like, it was, again, like Joanne Davis's light bulb. Like, oh my gosh, why am I not just running myself? She also self-recruited. Now let's turn to a Northwest Ohio trailblazer, also one of our bonus trailblazers on the website. Donna Owens is the first woman mayor of Toledo, Ohio. And we'll see if I can get it to play.
I went to every single board meeting. One board member slept every single time. And I thought, something's wrong with this picture. I could do better than that. But, end result, I lost. He came in first. Which then set that political fire in me.
I love this quote from Donna Owens. She is a shy person, a self-described shy person. She got involved in the Mothers Club at her children's school, and they elected her vice president. And so her job was to go to all of the Washington local school board meetings. And she observed a gentleman on the board sleeping. And that's what prompted her. She self-recruited. All right. Notice again, what's the finding from the literature that we're seeing play out here? These women were not recruited. They went on to great heights. They were not recruited by political party gatekeepers. This is Ryan McClin. She's the first African-American woman in the Ohio Senate. Now, this is less about her deciding to run because she actually got her start. Her father had served in the Ohio House for 22 years. When he died of cancer, when he was dying of cancer, I should say, he had made clear to the Speaker of the Ohio House of Representatives that he wanted his daughter to succeed him. So on his death, she was appointed to his seat and served 2 terms. Then she decided to run for Senate. Remember that finding in the literature, which is women are assumed they can't run, all right? They're assumed that they're less winnable, right, than men. Well, for Black women, there's not just that notion of your gender is a hindrance, right? But for Black women, they have that additional challenge of race. This is what Ryan McClin had to say about the first campaign manager she hired running for Ohio Senate.
When I was running for state senate, my first campaign manager that I had, we went to an event in Troy, and he looks around and he says to him, he said, you know, this is going to be a challenging race because the other candidate's black. Well, I'm the only black person in the room, so everybody stopped, they turn around and looked at me. I'm saying, if you're saying this, you already have let me know that you have a difficulty in understanding that we're not going about being black, we're going about representing.
She fired the campaign manager. And hired a new one and was elected in that race, became the first African-American woman in the Ohio Senate. So again, women are perceived as not able to win. And for women of color, there's that double challenge for them. And I think Ryan McClynn's, her experience in that first Senate race is really illuminating. Let's turn to Marcy Capture, another Northwest Ohio, probably of all these women, maybe most familiar to those of you in the room. And let's hear her story. I'm going to stand over here because as she talks, I want to pause and stop. It's a little bit longer about quotation, but it really does underscore some key findings from this project that were in the quantitative literature.
I called a couple of my friends who were political, right? Because I worked in campaigns my whole life. I helped other people, right? Really thought about myself and tried to recruit me to run for Congress. I worked on my PhD, you know, it's like the dream of a lifetime. And I said, Congress? And I laughed. Senior Gino Gormley,
I just started
the
it over by
office
accident.
of Attorney General.
Let's go back. Clearly, working with these audio clips. Let's stop right there with what Marcy Capture said. She does get a call. She does get recruited. And they want her to run for Congress. And she laughs. Kind of like, oh, you gotta be kidding, right? Women tend to underestimate themselves. Women tend to discount their own qualifications. And that's one reason why so few women run. This has been a finding in the literature for many years. It continues to be a finding today. Young women, women who in college, just graduated from college, they don't tend to see themselves as qualified to run for office, even when they've done, you know, the same kinds of things that men have done. It's men who say, oh, I could do that. I think I'll run, right? So we even see here, and she is now the longest serving woman in the US Congress, not just the US House of Representatives, which is where she was when I started my project, by the way. It took so long that Marcy Capture is now the longest serving woman in the entire Congress. Okay. She goes on then to say that she's trying to decide whether she should run for Congress. And she and her mother go to the supermarket and she runs into a high school friend. And this friend, she says, how are you? And the woman burst into tears and said, Marcy, life is so tough. I'm the only one working. I've got custody of my grandchild. My husband's out of work. And here's Marcy saying, I thought, here I am in college. She's hardly holding it together. And that really, really had an influence going on me going forward. And I thought, you know what? 6 months out of my life or 8 months, whatever it was, I'm going to do this. This is her decision to run. And notice how she was puzzling over whether to do it. What made her finally decide, yes, I'll throw my hat in the ring, was the story of somebody really down on her luck that she thought she could help. Again, here, when you ask in these surveys of hundreds of women and men, and why did you decide to run for office? Guess who's more likely to mention wanting to solve problems, wanting to help people? Women or men? Women. Marcy Capture here, her individual story really underscores one of the key findings in the scholarly literature that men tend to say, I've always wanted to run, this was a goal of mine from my youth and what have you. Women, you rarely hear them say that. Okay. Now, let's turn to another Northwest Ohio And by the way, this is I've mentioned a couple of parties, but it's a bipartisan group of women, Democrats and Republicans. Betty Montgomery is a Republican. She's the first woman Attorney General of Ohio and the first woman Auditor of State. And let's hear what she just has to say about her race for Attorney General. She already served, I think she was going to run for a third term as county prosecutor, and this possibility came up that maybe she'll run for Attorney General. Let's hear what she has to say.
Office of Attorney General was open. The incumbent had lots of money and everybody thought he couldn't be beaten. So that's when they go and they recruit a woman. They need a woman on that. There's no woman. So this is a throwaway race. And this is like, we need to fill it. And so who do we fill it with? Nobody gave me a chance. Nobody thought I would win. So you don't get a lot of pushback. It's like, oh, we had somebody fill that seat, so she's running. So they were all very polite with me, you know, because you have, you're not gonna win, but you know, thank you for doing this.
I guess the audio clip should go on to say, at the end of the day, I won. That was very typical of women and women getting on the ballot and women being considered for office in the 1970s, 1980s. That was at a time when, and there was, and in part, you know, because of the women's movement and all sorts of factors, parties realized that it was a good look actually to have some women on the ballot, but then where were they going to put them, right? And Betty Montgomery makes clear that women were often steered into those unwinnable races, which is what the quantitative literature had demonstrated. It really brings that quantitative finding to life. How were these women received by the press? You remember what the, you know, normally they don't even get covered, and if they do, it's trivial coverage. Well, let's first summarize what I found amongst this group of trailblazing women. They were sometimes completely ignored by the press. They were sometimes objectified by the press. They were sometimes written off. And often it was their family status, whether they were married or had children, that was what got mentioned in their articles. Let's listen to a quote from Helen Rankin. She was the first African-American elected to the entire General Assembly. She succeeded her husband, who died unexpectedly in office. And by the way, that in itself is kind of a key finding. In the 20th century, for most of the 20th century, often women were appointed to fill the term of a loved one. That was a common path for women getting into elected office for much of the 20th century. Here she is talking about the media.
Yeah, there's another difficult group to deal with. I did not get coverage here in the city of Cincinnati. I did not even get the endorsements. They refused to endorse me throughout the 8 years. The Enquirer. The Post did a couple of times, but the Enquirer, they never did. The only time the Enquirer gave me publicity was when I was leaving.
I'll stop it there in the interest of time, but she goes on to say that they really wanted to interview her and do a big feature article on her because she was the first African-American woman in the Ohio General Assembly and she was retiring. And she refused to give them the interview, which I kind of loved, right? So this is a case of a woman just could not get coverage. She mentions the Post. The Enquirer, many of you have heard of the Cincinnati Enquirer, that's the largest circulating newspaper in Cincinnati. The Post is an African-American newspaper, and so that's the paper that she said did a couple times endorsed her. Now let's hear from Nancy Hollister. She's the first woman lieutenant governor of Ohio and the only woman to serve as governor of the state of Ohio. She took office and served for 11 days when Governor George Voinovich resigned to be sworn into the US Senate. Here's what she said about coverage from the press when she became lieutenant governor. Okay, again, I've got to catch myself. I don't have the audio. I'm gonna read it to you. It's a dramatic moment. I got a call from a reporter who asked what I was going to be sworn in as lieutenant, what I was wearing to be sworn in as lieutenant governor. I said, oh, come on. This isn't about what I'm wearing. This is about what I intend. And so she treated the press very forthrightly. She also already won the election, right? She was going to be sworn in as lieutenant governor, but they wanted to know what she was wearing to be sworn in. And her reaction was, and she didn't say it like this, oh, come on. Nancy Hollister is really, she really is, she just says things in ways, many of these women do, they're great storytellers. Here's Joan W. Lawrence. She's one of my bonus trailblazers on the website. Does anyone know or remember Joan Lawrence? She lives in Columbus. She is a former state president of the League of Women Voters. And she was also the first woman elected to the Big Walnut Board of Education. And the first woman to represent 3 central Ohio counties in the Ohio House. And she says, there was a lot to be desired in the Big Walnut School Board. So I decided to run and see. And I had a certain amount of background like that about the law and the budget. So I remember going to talk to the newspaper editor, telling him what I was going to do. And he said, well, good idea to do it, but you won't be elected. We've never had a woman, he said. All right, here we go. Political gatekeeper, the press. You'll never make it. I'm assuming you're gonna lose. Multiple of my trailblazers have stories to tell like this. Finally, I'm gonna turn to Mary Ellen Withrow. She's a former US Treasurer. Her breakthrough election, she was the first woman elected to the tiny town of, it's a village, I think, the village of Elgin Local School Board. She rose to become Treasurer of the United States. Here's what she had to say about the press. When I wanted to advertise in the newspaper, they wouldn't print my name, Mary Ellen Withrow. It had to be Mrs. Norman Withrow. That was 1969. It wasn't until 1976 that they would print my name, Mary Ellen Withrow. And of course, it was on the ballot, Mary Ellen Withrow. I even remember going to one of the Democratic women's events in Ashland area. It was a big state meeting. They wouldn't refer to me as Mary Ellen Withrow, it was Mrs. Norman Withrow. It had to be that. They were so insistent on it. I was the only woman on the ticket. It was unreal how that was so important at that time. I was furious inside, but I didn't say anything to them. I said, I'm the only woman on the ticket. I said, you need to use my name. I tried to do the inflection she uses, which is awesome. That is one of the ways in which the family status of women, but not men, in press coverage of women and men on the campaign trail in the 60s, in the 70s, the 80s, into the 90s, women were referred to as Mrs. Men. Now, some papers had conventions that was Mr. So-and-so and Mrs. So-and-so, but in the papers that didn't have such conventions, and I have a headline for the website that says, I can't remember the male candidate's last name, but it said, Smith, the headline, Smith, comma, Mrs. Withrow file papers to run. All right, is Smith also, what's Smith? A miss, right? A Mr., no, a Mr., and that was not used. All right, we are running out of time. So I'm gonna just quickly read through this last set of findings and just read quickly some of the sound bites. How are they treated? How are they treated on the campaign trail? How are they treated once elected? And gender stereotyping abounded. Gender stereotyping abounded. Here's what Joanne Davidson, the first woman speaker of the Ohio House, said. When I was running for county recorder, I went, and she became speaker of the Ohio House. When I was running for county recorder, I went to an event that I was invited by the host of the event, but must have been his wife, because he was standing out on the porch when I walked up and identified myself. I said, I'm Joanne Davidson and I'm running for county recorder. He kind of like, you see people do this to you, look up and down. And he said, well, I guess you could dust the books. Here's another one from Joanne Davidson. Again, she became Speaker of the Ohio House, and this is the press coverage, I'll quickly play it, that she got after being elected Speaker.
The dispatch ran a deadline, is she tough enough to think? So we started that, I felt like I was back in, actually, Brunswick City Council, you know. Should a woman be on city council, it's kind of like, is she tough enough to think? I think how, I'm trying to think of how to describe me, a soft-spoken, grandmotherly looking woman, and that's why it was the big headline, is she talking about? So that was my challenge, to prove that I was talking about the speaker. We were in session, late at night. So someplace during the session, thanks to Gideon.
I'm gonna pause it there for those of you who see the movie. You know that she goes on to tell a story about how she proved she was tough enough to be speaker, and it has to do with banging the gavel down really hard during a late night session of the House. This quotation gets at the press assuming she's not tough enough, raising that question, which is also, by the way, you'll remember from the findings on stereotyping, what scholars know, that people in those years stereotyped women as less tough, as less strong, and less decisive. Here's Nancy Hollister. And this is what happened. She became the first lieutenant governor of Ohio. But here's what happened when she decided to run for mayor of Marietta after serving 2 terms on the Marietta City Council. Here's what the reaction was.
In running for mayor, I knew I could do the job. And I knew city government, I knew where the problems were, where the positives were. My family was very supportive, and I announced my candidacy, and it was met with, really? We've never had a woman do that. Do you think women could run city government? You've got, you know, maybe 80 to 90 employees and it's a multi-million-dollar budget. Are you? And I was stunned. I was really surprised. I've been working on finance committee. I've been working on police and fire department. I've been doing all these things, and something like, you're really good where you are. Why would you do something else? And that was my first lesson in saying, whoa, folks.
So it was assumed that a woman couldn't handle the budget of the city of Marietta, despite the fact that she'd served on the city council's finance committee. She'd done all this work. She'd ridden around with police officers, had to get special permission to do it, but she did it. She had all that experience and yet was still questioned. This one I don't think I'll play. I'll just say Donna Owens, the first woman mayor of Toledo. I asked her, what was it like when you first got on Toledo City Council? How were you treated? And here's what she says. I was treated like, good morning, good afternoon, hi, bye. She was really dismissed and ignored by all the men on the city council. So what did she do? And this gets at, like, there's so much in this research. There's so much to dig into. I've touched on only a few of the main themes, but these women had to come up with strategies, right? And Donna Owens' strategy, not unlike Nancy Hollister, right? You get the experience, you serve on the finance committee, you're riding around with the, on the fire engines and in the police cars. And she did that kind of thing herself. So they wouldn't include her in the meetings. She talks about one time there was a business in the city that wanted to put up a sign. And the council was going to vote no, saying it was too large. And it had to be taken down. What she did, she drove out there herself to take a look. Wasn't large at all. Came back, reported to the council. So these women found ways to work around the biases they faced, the challenges they faced, the dismissiveness they faced. They had different strategies. Some of them used humor. Some of them really, like Nancy Hollister is a good example of that. Some of them just dug in and did the work. Donna Owens is a good example of that. Some of them really embraced, I'm the woman. I'm the woman on the ticket. Marilyn Withrow did that, rose to become treasurer of the United States. So I think what I'll do is just end by saying, this was my concern. When I started the project, what if my Trailblazer stories bore no resemblance to the published research findings? Clearly, I'm a worrier, and my fears were totally unfounded. And I guess I should have dressed it as like, I'm a careful, thorough scholar, right? Like, that's the work, that's what I'm trained to do. It was so amazing, however, I cannot tell you, as somebody who had spent years, I teach statistics and research methods to our political science majors. I think so much can be learned from running statistical models with interesting data to find gender-based differences. But there's nothing that can take the place of hearing a woman's story told in her own words about her experiences when it comes to the still male-dominated world of politics. So let me ask if there are any questions. Yes.
I just have a comment.
I was expecting some of that. I ran for state rep twice. No one ever asked me, was I married? Did I have kids? And it shocked me because it shocked me that it didn't happen. But I think we've come a way since the early 2000s, and that was a pleasant surprise.
Yes, I think there had been time there was going to be a follow-up slide, like optimism, right? So one of the things, the press coverage has really improved, okay? And the voter stereotyping scholars now who are doing those studies where they like manipulate Jane versus John and you don't know, you know what I mean? You're reading. Very little evidence today is found that voters are stereotyping. And you know why? They're voting for party, right? Party is what's driving the vote now, not is it a woman or a man on the ballot. So that's one reason, but lots of good improvement on some of these things. I'll let you follow up.
Just one more thing, the people that I know that were running were not also recruited in those traditional ways. I got a letter from Emily's List, the Matriots, women's group in Ohio that are recruiting folks. That is still, I think, pretty the way that women are being sought.
That's absolutely right. There's ongoing research that's being done out of the University of Virginia by a team led by Jennifer Wallace. She was one of my outside advisors on the documentary. She's really expert. Her expertise is on recruitment, political recruitment. And she and her co-authors are still finding to this day, you know, voters may not be stereotyping anymore, but political gatekeepers, they sure are still assuming that you need a man to run, and they're tending to still recruit men over women.
Last year, I went to a dinner out here in Toledo, and it was a Democratic dinner, and it showed bunches of women that there were more women in politics today than ever before in the state of Ohio. And it was wonderful as all these women got up and talked about some of these things and where we are now. We've made great strides in them recruiting women in our area.
We have, and in part that's because of some of these groups like the Matriots, Emily's List. There are groups on both sides of the aisle. The Joanne Davidson Institute. Joanne Davidson is one of my Republican trailblazers, and she founded an institute to recruit Republican women to run for office. Emily's List is a group out of DC. That's a national group that recruits pro-choice women. So really, across the spectrum, there are more and more of these groups. But when these women started to run, we heard from some of them who started in the 60s and the 70s, there were such groups. They didn't have, right, those resources to turn to. It's not unusual today that I will get an email that I get as just a political scientist. Hey, we're going to be coming to campus. Ready to Lead, I think, is one of the groups that does candidate training for women. So there are all kinds of new opportunities. And I would say that, yes, some big improvements in the numbers, although we have to keep in mind that we're still only about 30 to 33% of state legislatures, of Congress, of state executive office, so still room for improvement there. But when you're going from, you know, one woman member of the Ohio, or the US House of Representatives to now just over 100, I think about 120, and it's taken decades to get there. So there's still, and that's one of the big reasons we made the film, was I may have shown you a little bit of doom and gloom here, so I encourage you to watch the film, because these women are funny, they're smart, they're insightful, they have great advice, and they really see things vastly improved from when they were running, and their stories are truly inspirational. There were times, and my son Nathan can attest to this, when I felt like I was trying to climb Mount Everest. I've never made a documentary film, right? I'm used to just, you know, reading books and collecting data and writing things up. And those days when I felt like, why did I ever take this project on? I feel like this is impossible. Will it ever be done? They were my inspiration. If they could run like Nancy Hollister did, 6 months pregnant with her, I think it was her 4th child, for city council, pulling her little boys in a wagon, going door to door, I can do this, right? If these women could, you know, get up in the morning and like Betty Montgomery go canvassing in Wood County, running for county prosecutor, and literally have voters slam the door in their face, I can do this. And so I urge you, if you're interested, to go to www.bgsu.edu/trailblazers, and you can see the film. And it's, if you know an educator as well, or you are an educator, it's a great resource for teaching women's political history in our classrooms across the state. So thank you so much for having me. It's been really nice being here. Thank you for the wonderful lunch. Thank you, Jennifer, for reaching out, and I hope you all enjoy this beautiful day. Take care.
Thank you very much, Melissa, for not just putting this whole thing together, but for taking your time here. Here is a very small token. Thank you so much.
Do we have
Yeah.
Use the microphone.
recorded? Yeah.
So, sign on. So I'm going to announce the winners of the raffle, and we did have 3 early winners of the 3 early raffles. And I sent an email, so you guys may have seen this already. So the first early bird prize, which is Lisby Pollock's casserole dishes, is Judy Curley. Winner of the second early bird prize, which is the group of 4 sculptures, was Anne. The third early bird prize, which is Judy Mosley's dishes that she made, is Patty Lusher. Okay. So the first grand prize, which is 6 cut lead crystal wine glasses, a corkscrew, and a bottle of wine, that is Kristen Romaine Lachowski. Yay! It's not a gift, your raffle. The second grand prize is the trifecta of quilt table runners. There's a heart-shaped one, and a heart-shaped casserole serving dish. And the winner of that is Michelle McFarland. I don't, should we just do a break?
Okay.
And, yeah. We're gonna take a couple minute break while we gather the, silent.
Good, 2 minutes to go read